Welcome back to Faith Walk with Debbie. We're going to talk about what chemotherapy looked like. Chemotherapy type of cancer treatment uses one or more anti-cancer drugs as part of a standardized chemotherapy regimen. It can be administered through an IV or a port, but the port is a lot easier. It allows the needle to be inserted through it with little or no pain. It's also harder on the veins if an IV is used. My chemotherapy was administered through my port, which is right here. About an hour before chemotherapy was scheduled, I put numbing cream over the port and I covered it with plastic protection, which is showing here in the picture. And the plastic that was over it was just to keep the cream from getting all over everything in my clothes. So when I would get to the chemotherapy area, I was assigned a specific chemotherapy room. And once I went in there, I sat in a recliner, and the nurse took my blood pressure and she checked my pulse. Then she took a stethoscope, listened to my back, my chest, even my intestine areas, which I thought was always kind of strange, but they make sure that everything sounds good. Then she goes to her computer and she orders the chemotherapy prescription from the hospital pharmacy. And we wait until it's delivered. But in the meantime, the nurse removes the plastic that's over my port and cleans off that whole area very well. And in this particular picture, you see on this tray the needle that the nurse will use to insert in it, along with a tube that she attaches to it. Then the nurse takes that needle and she inserts it into the port. Now, one of my very first nurses that did this taught me that they would count to 3, and when they counted to 3, I took a deep breath. And honestly, it really helps. So it doesn't really hardly hurt when they put it in. So she inserts it. Then after she inserts it, she flushes it with heparin and also checks to make sure that the port functions good. If the port is not used for a period of time, it has to be flushed approximately every 4 weeks. Now here the nurse also puts plastic adhesive over the needle and some of the tube in order to take and hold it in place. And I usually tried to wear a neckline that was a little more scooped in order to be able to help it not be in the road. When the chemo drugs arrived from the pharmacy, the nurse would hook them up, and she would also check the computer to make sure the computer and her machine that she would hook them up to was the exact prescribed prescription. Then she would call another nurse over in order to verify it and double check to make sure that it was correct. Now, as the chemo would go in me, usually it would change the body temperature sometimes, and so they always offered me a heated blanket. And I would then recline in the recliner sometimes, and I would cover up with the blanket. That's what this picture shows me, sitting in the recliner with the warm blanket over me, and it always was really comforting. And it really was needed. When I was in chemo, after a period of time, I would take and feel chilled because my body temperature would change. Then also, depending on the time of day, they offered me a sandwich, chips, and a drink. But if it wasn't lunchtime, usually it was just chips and a drink if I wanted. But I found in the very beginning that sometimes when they put that heparin in, it left a really weird taste in my mouth. So the salt from the potato chips helped to remove the weird taste. I also was very grateful when I could eat, because then I could take my mask off. They weren't real picky with it back there, but I tried to keep it up when the nurse came into the room. Sometimes they gave me pre-meds before the chemo, such as steroids or Benadryl, in order to be able to help so I wouldn't have chemo reactions. However, the last 12 chemotherapies that I had Benadryl was definitely a big pre-med. And they didn't even have to tell me when they were putting it in, because within a few minutes, I could feel it. I would get extremely tired, and as a result, I'd usually cuddled up in the recliner and I tried to take a nap. Sometimes it made me so groggy that I had a difficult time putting thoughts together. I will never forget trying to talk to this nurse. My brain knew what I wanted to say, but it's like it just couldn't get to my mouth to get out. I just was so out of it because the Benadryl just really made me tired and groggy. And because of that, I also had to have somebody drive me home after chemotherapy. Usually I drove my car from work to chemotherapy, but then I needed a ride home, so we arranged it that my mom would pick my husband up, take him to the hospital about the time I was done, during those times that he wasn't allowed to be with me because of COVID. Then my husband would drive me home. That way we didn't have two cars left at the hospital and had to try to figure out how to get home. During my first few months of chemotherapy, I was allowed one person with me, and that always brought me comfort. However, as the months passed, COVID-19 got worse and they restricted visitors. During the height of COVID-19, the chemotherapy area also was converted into hospital bed overflow. So as a result, the chemotherapy area was moved a couple times to temporary areas. This picture shows how they made wall supports with PVC pipe and then covered them with tarps. One of the nurses said she felt like she was working in a war zone medical area. It really was makeshift-like. The nurses made the change work as well as possible, but it was difficult. It was harder for the patients too because there was not as much privacy. And because the dividers did not go all the way to the ceiling like walls were in the main chemo area, it was a lot noisier. Therefore, the noise carried a lot further, and it made some of the patients a lot more anxious and harder for them to be able to endure the chemo. Depending on the type of chemo and how the chemo affected the people or me, blood levels could be affected, and they would sometimes give Nulasta. I received Nulasta after the first 4 chemos. It helped to build up the bone marrow. In turn, when the bone marrow was built up, it helped to improve the blood levels. Insurance had to make a choice if they was going to have me take a shot or use this Nulasta device that would go on the back of my arm, and they chose to use the Nulasta device. After chemo, the nurse attached it to my arm with adhesive that was on the back side of it. And within a couple minutes, I heard a beeping sound. It automatically inserted a needle in my arm, and it barely hurt. I was glad they didn't do the shot. I was glad that I had this. It was just like a little snap of a rubber band, so it really barely hurt when the needle went in. The green light blinked, showed it worked. About 27 hours later, there would be another beeping sound, and it administered medicine. Then the green light flashed faster and faster. About an hour later, the green light turned red, and when it turned red, that indicated it was time to be removed. But because it was on the back side of my arm, it was hard for me to be able to get to it, so my husband had to loosen the adhesive and then pull it off. When the Nulasta was given, I was also encouraged to take Claritin before and after chemo because it helped to prevent leg and hip pain, which was a side effect of the Nulasta. Because Nulasta built up the bone marrow, the greatest intensity of bone marrow was in the hip and the upper leg area, which could cause severe pain. I was grateful I took Claritin because I never had any leg or hip pain. However, the Claritin really aggravated my sinuses, and so we had to end up lessening the amount of dosage I took of Claritin because it just really bothered me. The last 12 chemo treatments were weekly, and because Nulasta can only be given every 2 weeks, if my blood levels fell, then I wasn't allowed to take the Nulasta. So they had another type of shot that could be administered weekly if I needed it, and it helped to build up the bone marrow when the blood levels fell low. But this shot, Claritin, would not help, and it hurt. And I had pain in my leg, down my leg, in my hip. It really hurt. I also was given a color-coded calendar that really helped me keep track of all of the appointments. You see, the week that I would have chemotherapy, within 72 hours prior to that, I had to have lab work done. And between the lab work and the chemotherapy, I had to see my oncologist to verify that the lab work was good enough for me to be able to have chemotherapy. And so the calendar also helped to show if I had to take any medicines, pre-meds like Claritin or steroids before my chemotherapy. And so it really helped me keep track the grueling schedule a lot clearer. Now, chemotherapy regimens can vary depending on the type of cancer. So next time, I'm going to share the specific regimen that my IU thymus guru, along with my local oncologist, chose specifically for my situation. I'm going to explain how I felt during chemo, along with side effects that I experienced. So now I would just like to thank you that you've come along on this journey again. And I want to leave you with a scripture thought. Hebrews 11:1 in the New Living Translation says, "Faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. It gives us assurance about things we cannot see." You see, my faith is what kept me going through all of this, all the bad times when circumstance looked bad. I had to have faith that my God was going to take and give me the strength to make it through.